Are we ready? Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. The Food for Thought series is aimed at creating awareness about the benefits of eating locally. Eating locally grown food does not just benefit our body, but it also benefits the environment. Eating local has a far reaching health, economical, and environmental aspect in today's discussion. Dr. Sharad and I will discuss these benefits and also help you understand how small steps taken by each one of you can impact our earth positively. Dr. Sharad Chandra Lele is a distinguished fellow in environmental policy and governance at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, ATRE, and this is Chef Michael Swami. As a brand, I'm working with resorts in the Himalayan range in Madhya Pradesh with Waxpol, with Pagdandi Wildlife Resorts, creating menus and cooking with produce from their organic farms. Using local ingredients and creating stunning menus and unique presentations with local dishes is what I am all about. Training staff is the biggest challenge, but the joy that one gets is when you see happy faces on the guests when they're eating local food with a difference. Food is the epicenter of our moods, our emotions, and our memories. It's all about understanding nature. It is understanding the custodians of nature, large and small. The bee, as tiny as it is, can make or break the cycle of life. Similarly, this knowledge of the source of one's food and water is paramount in today's day and age. It is not just about the cooking and the eating. It's about the understanding and experiencing local cuisine, its relationship with what is all around us, and how both the food and the environment are codependent. We come down to a very important question on sustainability, the profitability of sustainable living. What is food sustainability and lifestyle sustainability? Our industrialized diet of refined flour, poor quality fats, and an unbelievable amount of sugar has set the stage for diabetes to thrive. Our very notion of life is threatened by climate change and what others thrust upon us. As chefs, we are given a choice to feed people. And as chefs, we create brands and trends. Yet as chefs, we are given a responsibility despite the fact that a client is paying for a meal or not. So as home cooks, it is our responsibility to our families. It's our responsibilities to talk about food. It is not just about talking recipes. It's talking about the geographic nature of an ingredient, the seasonality of an ingredient, and the changes that happens to one's body. Sorry for that, but the seasonality of an ingredient and what changes happens to one's body during each season. As a people, we have lost touch with nature and we've lost touch with the farmer. Our earlier parents, our grandparents chatted with the farmers. They chatted with the bhajiwala who came next door. They had long chats about what was in season, what was out of season. But today, we're dependent on the supermarket. So at the end of the day, who benefits? Not us. Uh, the big consumer bodies. So when we talk about what do we eat and what do we drink, should it be full of the chemicals and pesticides? Or are we as a people standing together and questioning what we are serving to people and what is being served to us? We need to question. And until we, as cooks, as chefs, we start questioning, change will not happen. Uh, we're talking about ingredients. Uh, the very soil, the very soil that from that is being used to produce these ingredients is beneficial to our bodies. but the soil content all across the country and the world is different. So an ingredient grown in South America, for example, may not be good for us here in India. Kiwi fruit being grown in Australia, is it good for the Indian body? You have quinoa, quinoa coming from South America. We have ragi, we have millets, we have so many wonderful things in India, which is created from the soil, which is adaptable to our Indian bodies. And that's how we should start looking at change. How do we change our menus at home? As a housewife, as a layperson, who do I look up to change these menus? There are a lot of chefs doing fantabulous dishes on TV, but are they really bringing about a change? Are our TV chefs bringing about a change? The change has to come from within us. How do we change our recipes? And for this, I'm going to leave all these scientific questions to Dr. Sharad Lele to answer. And over to you, Dr. Sharad.
Hi, Michael. Thanks a lot. Uh, I'm not sure I'm up to the challenge that you have thrown to me for a number of reasons. One of which is that I'm a foodie myself, so I cannot resist trying all kinds of food, whether it's Indian or foreign. Although I tend not to eat too much of meat, but other than that, I really enjoy food. I almost live to eat rather than eat to live, and that can be a handicap when one is thinking about sustainable food. The second big handicap is that I have a very sweet tooth. So as I will come to it later in my comments, that can be a real obstacle to sustainable food. But just let me share a few fun thoughts from my own work. As academics, we tend to always want to complicate things. And I think I'm going to start by taking Michael's points and then complicating them a little bit by saying that what do we mean by sustainable food, right? And Michael emphasized one issue in particular: local food. But in that shorthand called local food, there are actually many layers hidden in that. Many different angles of sustainability that you can see when from his remarks are hidden in that. I'm just going to try to unpack them a little bit. So we could, for example, sustainable food means it has a low carbon footprint. It's something that, and that's one reason why you should go for local food. You could also say sustainable means low pesticide and chemical use, or if preferably zero pesticide and chemical use, what we say is organic farming. You could also think of sustainable food as something which has a low water footprint. And this is something that is particularly important in the Indian context, where we are a country that depends on the monsoon for rainfall. We have a limited amount of water. We are not like one of the European countries where there is water throughout the year, where there is snow melt and so on and so forth. There is limited amount of water available for a very large population. And we have to be by and large self-sufficient in food. So then the whole question of the limitation of water, the scarcity of water, and are we eating food that respects the scarcity of water becomes really important. There is also a fourth dimension, which is a biodiversity loss. I was work in the Western Ghats earlier. I could see that many tracts of forest in the Western Ghats had been converted into coffee and later on into tea plantations. And as we know, in the Northeast as well, large tracts of forest have been converted. You know, Darjeeling tea is famous, but it has come at the expense of a lot of forest. So I know several friends of mine who gave up tea and coffee, in order to sort of make a point about not wanting to cause more biodiversity loss. There are a couple of more angles to this issue of what is sustainable food. There is the question of whose livelihoods are we supporting? Are we supporting the livelihoods of small and marginal farmers um, in the whole process of consuming food? Supporting much more, you might say it's to an extent, of course, correlated, and I'll come back to the correlations in a minute, but keeping the question of livelihood support in mind. And finally, of course, the point that Michael started with, food that is healthy for the consumer, in some sense, because if the consumer is not sustained, there's not going to be any discussion left for us to have in terms of what constitutes sustainable food consumption. So these are at least the 6 layers that I can think of, and there are probably more angles to this when we talk about sustainable food. And one of the challenges that I'd like to highlight to sort of complicate our lives a little bit is to say that it is a challenge to find food or food consumption habits that actually meet all these criteria. because, for example, I could find food that is close by, grown next to me in Bangalore, but which is often very pesticide intensive. Or I could go for organic food, and that might turn out to be then imported from New Zealand, apples imported from New Zealand or something. Low water footprint doesn't necessarily mean, again, organic, and so on and so forth. So we have to really think about all these dimensions. It doesn't mean that we can make all those transitions simultaneously or instantaneously, but these are some of the angles that we need to be thinking of when we say what is sustainable food. I'd like to sort of pause at this point, because I think we can talk theory, but I'd love to toss the ball back to Michael in terms of talking about some practical experience and angles that he has on initiating work on sustainable food. And then I'll come back maybe with a few more examples. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Dr. Lely. When I was here in Madhya Pradesh, I one day was passing through these fields. I decided to get out of the Jeep, walk into the field, and literally started planting rice with some of the farmers. I spent a couple of hours, and I must say it was backbreaking. But a very good point about the low water consumption. How much water goes into producing 1 kilo of rice? How much water goes into producing 1 kilo of meat? How much water goes into producing 1 kg of sugarcane? It is phenomenal. And when you drop those products, I won't say drop eating those products, but eat less of those products. Then the farmer is going to get affected, and he's going to stop using that much water. The water table is going down. As chefs, we only think of food and recipes, but we also need to start talking about the science behind it. The science behind what is food doing to our planet? What is food doing to us? The high pesticides, the high, so many things, GM food. I'm allergic to nuts, I'm allergic to brinjals, but that is only in the recent years. And that is because of GM food, genetically modified food. But we as chefs need to put a stop to it. The housewives need to put a stop to it. The day you stop drinking milk, you will see a change. No animal drinks another. Uh, no animal drinks milk after it's grown up. So do we as humans really need the milk? And if you look at it, who owns the big sugar conglomerates? They are the ones who are making us eat sugar. The sugar in virtually everything that we eat. Right. So again, when we come back to eating local, where is my produce coming from? Who is growing it? Chat with them, talk to the farmer. I was setting up a restaurant in Delhi, and I said, I'm not just going to order from the vendor, I'm going to meet the farmer. I went, sourced the farmer, spoke to them. They were very happy. And that's when I learned a lot of things. So that's the time when we as consumers have to start questioning what we are eating. And that's also very apt in when we are eating local. In Madhya Pradesh, they grow just one crop, and that is rice. For 7 months of the year, the land is barren. And right behind me, you will see they've just cultivated the rice paddy. And right now it's going to be barren right up till the monsoons. There are acres and acres and acres of land not being used. They can easily use it to recultivate it, to grow more produce, to create that change. But that change will only come when initiatives are put in place, when they are taught to putting things into place, when you teach them how to grow something more than rice. And that change is happening slowly. That change is happening all around the resorts we work in, because they see that we are willing to buy cucumber, cauliflower, carrots, and we are spending time teaching them how to grow these things. But what about the country at large? I think it has to be done along with, with great doctors like Dr. Sharad, doing things to bring about the change. And that can only come when we start questioning. Over to you, Doctor.
Hi. Thanks, Michael. So I'm sharing this slide here, which is the work of my student, Mijit Bhar. And one of the things he looked at was the water footprint, carbon footprint, and air pollution footprint produced by our lifestyles. So he's looking at the lifestyle as a whole. And what you see in the x-axis are income deciles. So on the left end are the poorest 10%, and the right end is the richest 10% of the Indian population. And he's analyzed in this graph is the water footprint of their consumption habits. And here, of course, consumption includes the blue, which is the food consumption, the orange, which is the non-food consumption, as well as what he's called luxury consumption, which is the gray. What is interesting is that even when you go to the richest decile, the richest 10% of the population, their food-based water footprint is still rising. That to me, that was a really interesting insight. Otherwise, normally we would say, "Arey, khana kitna khayenge log?" At some point people have to stop eating, and then they spend more money on cars, they spend more money on going for holidays to some fancy place, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, their carbon footprint is indeed rising. But at the same time, we see that the water footprint is really rising, and we looked at why that might be the case, and we find that, of course, as Michael mentioned quite rightly, paddy is one of the most water intensive crops. 1 kilo of paddy takes about 2,500 liters of water to grow. But at the same time, it's sugar, milk, and wheat. As you can see, very often we switch to much more of a wheat-based diet, more chapatis. We, of course, increase a lot of sugar consumption. And mind you, the wheat is coming not only as chapatis, it's coming in a lot of processed form. It's coming as biscuits. It's coming in a variety of these processed food, which, by the way, have governmental subsidies for food processing. And that's actually part of the structural problem that we should be thinking about. But as we can see, the choice of eating more sugary or wheat-based products, milk, is definitely going to influence the water footprint of that particular diet. So this is just an example of how we can do certain kinds of analysis to look at our water footprint and then get into questions of how we should rethink our diet based on that. And I wanted to come to a couple of examples of that. I think I mentioned that there are many layers or many dimensions of sustainable food habits. So if you're talking only about pesticides, you might say, oh, well, the answer is simple. We should be eating organic food. Now, the question is, how do you find it? And luckily, now many state governments have taken the initiative to make space in their food distribution or fruit and vegetable distribution network for organic food. And this is a trend that we need to encourage, we need to support, and we need to push for its expansion as much as we can. The challenge comes, for example, when we talk about the water footprint. So you say, okay, I should be reducing my rice food eating habit. What do I do? And we have forgotten, and this is, when I say we, I mean people at the upper end of the economic ladder. We've kind of forgotten that, in fact, rice was not a dominant crop in many parts of the country. I live in Bangalore, and the traditional food around Bangalore was actually ragi. It's a millet, and its equivalent in northern Karnataka and in Maharashtra is jowar. And if you go further north from Maharashtra to the border with Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh, the equivalent or the substitute for that is bajra. So we've got, and of course, in the tribal belts, and I wanted to share this with Michael also, that if you go to the tribal belts of Madhya Pradesh, Michael, you still find a lot of kodo kutki kind of millets being consumed. Another student of mine, Venkat, lived for a year and a half with the Baiga and Gond tribals in Baigachak of Madhya Pradesh, border of Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. And he found that, in fact, kodo kutki were making a comeback,
Yes.
not only because they are the traditional food of the Adivasis, but now they've also found a market for kodo and kutki among people like us who are willing to move out of rice and experiment with millets, which perhaps we have forgotten or we were not in touch with, till 500 years ago. So I think that's a very interesting and positive trend. We need to expand on that. We need to overcome our biases about, अरे वो सफेद बासमती का पुलाव जब तक नहीं खाएंगे तब तक पेट नहीं भरेगा. Or till I don't have my tair sadam at the end of my meal, I won't feel satisfied. I think these are all culturally ingrained habits, and we need to try to stretch ourselves to go beyond that into eating ragi, jowar, kodo, kutki, and other kinds of much more water-saving crops. The additional benefit, and if you remember, the sixth point I had made was food that is healthy for the consumer. It turns out that switching from rice to ragi, switching from rice to jowar or bajra for that matter, has also health benefits, because these crops contain much more iron and micronutrient content compared to the kind of rice that we are been consuming. Note that the rice that we consume often is very polished rice. It's completely white rice, so it's got lost all its other nutrients. and it only contains carbohydrates. So the switch from rice to these millets has a double benefit. It has a water footprint benefit for the environment, as well as a personal benefit in terms of improved health. So I think from both perspectives, it's a win-win for us to switch to millets. The bigger challenge, as I said, for somebody like me, is to give up on sugar, or at least reduce our sugar consumption, so that we're effectively reducing the sugarcane crop expansion that's going on in the country. Even in the driest parts of Karnataka, we find farmers sinking borewells and growing sugarcane, because there is an assured market for sugar, and that's really what they're gunning for. The last point I want to make is that there are many outlets for various kinds of local foods, as well as foods coming from Adivasi regions, foods coming from organic sources, foods coming from even ways of encouraging the growth of forest foods, for example. There's a very beautiful book that has come out recently where people have documented the forest foods of central India and other parts of South and Southeast Asia. Madhu Ramnath is one of the authors of that book. I think people would be very interested in reading that. There are groups working with Adivasi communities, spreading the use of, for example, mahua-based laddus, mahua-based various ingredients or items that people would like to consume. So I just want to say that there are a number of things that are happening. We just need to look a little bit, scratch the surface, and we can locate these alternative food farms, food outlets, food sources, and look for a win-win between those multiple criteria that I said. Local food, food that supports Adivasi livelihoods, food that is actually healthier for you and healthier for the environment. So I'd like to toss it back to Michael in terms of talking a little bit about the challenges that he may have faced when he tried to make this transition in his own thing. One last point, of course, Michael, is that in today's day and age, we should be saying cooks, not necessarily housewives. I think all of us, especially the males, if we haven't learned cooking, we better learn it fast
Yes.
and share that burden of cooking and the burden of transitioning to a sustainable food lifestyle with our partners.
Yes.
Over to you.
So, thank you so much, Doctor. When I started with Pagdandi Safaris, we noticed that all the resorts were serving a very Punjabi-oriented cuisine all across the country. You name it, it was always about Punjabi food. And the local cuisines, the state cuisines were kind of disappearing. And that's when we said, we've got a lot of tourists coming here. So every meal was from a different region of the country. We also started playing around with the local millets at Pagdandi Safaris. So our food, the food at the lodges changed. The lodges around us started, I won't say copying, I hate to use the word copying, but emulating us. They also brought about a change. The farmers around us started growing the crops we needed for the resorts because they saw the economic viability of it. Then we'd go and visit them. We'd talk to them about to stop using so much pesticides, stuff like that. They started changing their habits. And these were some of the challenges that I faced was with my cooks. The cooks still wanted to do things the traditional way. By traditional way, I mean a lot of oil, a lot of ghee, a lot of butter, a lot of sugar. And I had to get them to change. And I used to earlier come for 3 or 5 days. And the day I'd left the property was the day they went back to their old habits. So I started staying longer for a month, 2 months at each property. And that's when the change started getting noticeable. The guests started loving the food. Kodo, which is a millet. There's also a sweet rice grown here in these local areas. But the wild boar comes and eats it because it's sweet. So they stopped growing it. So we helped them build fences and said, grow it. It's such a delicious rice quality. It's very sweet. And they started growing it. We started using it. So these are the little changes. We even have a tribal thali at the resort. Tribal thali. We have the Bhopali Nizami thali, which is again the local cuisine. And these little changes made the locals see that there was more to food outside of their own state. Guests coming here also got a whole different experience. At the end of the day, it's about the experience. And as us home cooks and chefs, uh, we need to learn how to use the millets, how to use everything that is organic. I don't see why organic should be more expensive because organic has been there for thousands of years. It's only pesticides has been what? Not even 200 years. They've been around, but yet the food grown with pesticides is cheaper than the organic produce. Why? You know, there's less trouble to grow organic food. So why should it be more expensive? And I think we're reaching about half an hour, and I think we should now go to questions. Or
Yeah, I think we should. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. So please post your questions on the Facebook Live. In the meantime, I just wanted to add a couple of lines to what you said, Michael.
sure,
Fundamentally, yeah, as you said, the first barrier to making this shift is ourselves, because we are
right,
so brought up in a particular kind of cuisine, and then we think that wherever we go, we want that familiar cuisine rather than we won't be willing to try that change, whether it's outside or later on in our own homes as well. So I think the first barrier to change is ourselves. But the second barrier to change, I think one of the reasons why pesticide and fertilizer based, chemical fertilizer based food is cheaper is because of government subsidies. The government has heavily
okay,
subsidized this in the assumption that, well, it produces more food, therefore it solves our food problem. Now, as we know, we are a food surplus nation, and the pendulum has
yes,
swung too far in the direction of excessive subsidies for fertilizer and pesticides, which has created a sort of a vested interest of its own. The big manufacturers of these chemicals become the lobbyists for continuing those practices. The same, as you mentioned very rightly, is true for sugar. There's a massive lobby that works in favor of the production of sugar. And the sugar factories and the MLAs that own sugar factories are a big source of the problem, because they come in the way of any attempt to move away from excessive sugar production. Nobody says that we can do without sugar completely, but we are too far down the road in terms of the amount of sugar that we are promoting in terms of production and in consumption. So we need to be thinking both as individual consumers, how do we change our own habits, but also be thinking of the structural changes that are required. The subsidies for processed food like glucose biscuits and potato chips, you'll be surprised that subsidies that were initiated with the idea that you need to help poor farmers get a reasonable price in the off season when the tomatoes are not available, whereas in the production season there was a tomato boom and everything collapsed, the price collapsed. In that context, the government gave subsidies for processing of tomatoes into ketchup like Kisan brand, the old Kisan brand ketchup that we had. Was the idea was that you support the farmer in sort of this avoid this boom bust cycle. What has transpired, however, is that the subsidies being used for instance, potato chips. A potato is not a perishable the way tomatoes are perishables, but the manufacturers are using the subsidy to essentially make really poor nutrition value potato chips available, as you can see, across the whole country. And those are the kinds of perverse structural problems that we, as not just as consumers but as citizens, we need to combine our role as a citizen and as a consumer to really push for those changes at a level which is higher than the individual's choice. And we need to acknowledge that and work at both ends. We need to confront our own
right,
choices,
right.
modify them as much as possible, but also then go on to questioning the forces that make switching more difficult than it should be. So there's a question, in fact, very closely related to the point I was making. Do you think individual choices can really make a difference? These problems seem so big. And I think we can't be caught in this binary of, do I work on the individual or do I work on the structural question? I think Michael has made a very important point that there is, especially the top 10%, to which I think many of us in this audience belong. We have a responsibility to question our consumption habits. And I mean in the food sector, I mean in the non-food sector as well. We have a real responsibility because there's no point in us comparing ourselves with Americans or Europeans and saying, oh, well, we are less consumptive, we have a lower footprint than them. The question is, can whatever footprint we have be extrapolated to everybody in India? And the answer is simply a no. It's just not possible. And if it's not possible, then there is an onus on us to shift our own consumption habits. And I see a huge resistance in our community ourselves, and I include myself in that. If you ask me to give up, sugar in my tea, how much am I willing to do that, or just cut down my tea consumption? So I think we have to confront that resistance as much as we talk about the structural question. I absolutely agree one person that will make an impact, but lots add up. All the drops will add up to an ocean. So I think that's really important that we do that. There's also a question about, I think, recipes for local foods. I think there is now excellent material outside available. Center for Science and Environment a few years ago put out this beautiful book illustrating recipes from local foods, vegetables, fruits, all kinds of stuff. Across India, they went out of their way to collect a whole bunch of recipes, traditional food recipes from unknown foods or less known foods like lotus stem or lotus seed or various other kinds of recipes, lots of greens in that, millets and so on, that I think you should really look at CSE's cookbook for these traditional foods. But I'm sure there's a whole bunch of material out there now on the internet and so on that we can definitely also add to that. Michael, do you have any recommendations in terms of sources of recipes for traditional foods?
I think I've always looked at food as technique based, not about recipes, where we use cooking techniques to perfect a recipe rather than take a recipe and just by heart a recipe. So it's just about knowing how to cook the millets first and then adapting it to the change, adapting it to what would I do if I add this, experiment. It's when you experiment that you really find yourself cooking well, rather than just saying, okay, here's a recipe, let me copy it, you know. So like say if I'm making a couscous is made traditionally with a wheat-based product. But what if I take the technique of making a couscous and use kodo millet with it? Or I make an upma using kodo millet. So I'm using the technique rather than searching for a recipe. I know how to make an upma or I know how to make a pulao. But now if I take short grain rice or say boiled basmati and want to make a biryani out of it, I take a healthier rice and make a biryani out of it. Why not? I don't need that long grain rice, fancy basmati rice to make a biryani. Yeah, so if you also look at biryani, where did biryani come from? It was from Punjab and those areas when the Mughals came. They incorporated their meats with rice, and that's how biryani came about. But it's only modern technology and all that people want this very fancy rice. But you still can make it with a short grain rice. Why not? You know?
Absolutely, absolutely. I just also wanted to add the point about rice. I think this is a very important point that even the rice that we eat is so polished. And I was thinking about why that is the case. It's a little bit like jaggery being more expensive than white sugar. Similarly, white rice is now easy to get, but you have a really hard time finding even unpolished rice, even if it is basmati or if it's your traditional rice variety, is not a particularly outlandish variety. Uh, uh, that that we might be thinking about. And I realized that there is a political economy behind rice polishing. So the what happens is that when these rice mills polish the rice of the farmer and give it back in polished form, the farmer is paying them a pittance, and
Yeah.
they are not really making any profit from the farmer. Whatever charges, the milling charges that farmers pay, their huge profit margin comes from selling the bran. The brand that they extract from the polishing process is sold for making animal feed and making bran oil, which is really expensive, but really supposed to be really healthy, but it's really expensive. And that's where these rice mills are really minting money. And it just shows that how now they have a vested interest in keeping the rice as polished as possible. So we have a tough time then finding unpolished rice. The farmer goes to them, says, don't polish it so much. They're not going to listen to the farmer. So we have to really think of those linking the farmer and the consumer in ways that will bypass some of these structures that have emerged in order to get at better quality food. Let me see if I can track down the book that I mentioned.
Okay.
In the meantime, we can go to the next question. There's a question, Michael, for you perhaps. What is the alternative to sugar?
There's all your natural sweeteners like I can use honey, you can use natural sweeteners, you can try and just avoid sugar on the whole by and large. Okay. Uh, what are natural sugars? Sugars like if I'm using raisins, for example, I'm cooking something with raisins, there's natural sugars in it. Cooking something with pineapple, which has natural sugars in it. So you're getting the natural sugars from these fruits coming into your dessert, making it sweeter, making it more palatable. You're not relying on processed sugars. That's the best way to go about it. So just use a lot of like prunes. I use a lot of prunes in my desserts. Prunes, raisins, pineapple, watermelon. They're so sweet by themselves. So when I reduce them into my food is when I get a lot of natural sugars into my desserts. Uh, I think that's the best way to go about it. Uh, I was also wanting to just go digress to another thing was earlier days we used to get a lot of mackerel, used to get a lot of prawns, used to get a lot of things. With climate change, all of them are searching for warmer waters or colder waters. They're going higher. You could get mackerel down in South India, and the South Indians love to eat mackerel. Now mackerel is being caught off the coast of Gujarat. Soon it'll be caught off the coast of Pakistan. And then where higher can it go? So the Bombay duck is almost extinct. Mackerel is also almost extinct. Prawns are out almost extinct. So what are we doing with our foods? Are we still questioning what we are eating? We need to look at these things before we even change our dietary habits. Eat the local fish. People are introducing tilapia to India. It's a fish that devours every other fish. But without thinking, we are buying it. Without thinking, we are ordering it. So we're going to kill our local fish because of a fish that is coming from abroad.
Right.
So we have to start questioning where our ingredients are coming from, even as chefs, even as home cooks. You know, yes, I love prawns. Yes, I love that big pomfret, but I have to stop ordering it because when we stop ordering it, the manager will or the restaurant people will question why we are stop ordering it. Then they will get the local fish.
I think that's a very important point, I think, Michael, what you made, which is that even though it seems that I'm just one person, what difference can I make? And somebody have posted a question about how do I find the shops are flooded with imported fruits and so on. How do I find local fruits? I think the answer is to go and question the shops and ask them, can you tell me what is the source of your fruit? Is it from India? Is it from abroad? Luckily, as far as just fruit is concerned, New Zealand apples or whatever, typically they have a label as a producer of New Zealand, producer of Australia, and so on. But it's not true for everything, and it's certainly not true. I mean, even your shopkeeper is often not able to tell you whether the mango is coming from the neighboring district or it's coming from way somewhere. You have to look at the variety and the season and figure it out for yourself. So, but questioning the shops, I'll give you another very small sort of example. Many of these shops will put chemicals in order to make the mangoes ripen early. Mangoes early part of the season, they're not really ripe, they're plucked unripe, and then they put this white powder into their boxes to make it ripen earlier. So we used to always think of that as an abomination, as a bad thing. You don't want to be consuming that chemical which is being used for ripening. So we asked the shopkeeper, do you use that white powder for ripening? So he said, of course, absolutely. We use for everything. So it's like that white powder had become a matter of prestige, that I'm up to speed with everybody else in terms of using chemicals for ripening. I think 10 years later things have changed a little bit, but it just tells you there is no. Then I told him that this is not why we were asking you about the white powder. We don't want it. And he was like puzzled. Why do you not want it to be ripened? So I think it's only when consumers question. 10 years later, the story has changed. Now the shopkeepers know that then they kind of say they're not using it, even if they are. But at least they'll say they're not using it.
Yeah.
It's a step in the right direction. We got to keep pushing them, quick, testing them. I think there are a couple of other questions, Michael, that you could help me out here. There is
question number 5, I think.
What to eat, what to eat and what not to eat. Is there a thumb rule? And secondly, related to that, immunity is the primary concern for everyone, especially during this pandemic. What is that one local ingredient we should all include in our diet?
I think each season, the best thing to eat seasonal, because seasonal is what your body needs. Your body doesn't need strawberries in, I would say winter. You don't need mangoes. Mangoes is a heaty fruit. You don't need it in winter. but yet you'll find it in the markets in winter. You have to eat seasonal. Your body is acclimatized to eating seasonal fruit. It's the best thing for your immunity. Seasonal fruit and seasonal ingredients, best thing for your immunity. Eat a lot of ginger, a lot of cloves, a lot of our spices are very good for immunity. Not all of them. You've got turmeric. Turmeric is excellent. Um, Alcohol, sugars, they all bring down your immunity. Right now, you need to boost your immunity. People are sitting at home and thinking about, oh, let me have a drink. Try and avoid it, because that is bringing down your immunity. Sitting out of boredom, you will result in eating more sugar. It will result in you eating more food at home, but that's going to increase your sugar levels. So you've got to be careful on both sides. You have to be prudent. A dietitian will say, eat this, eat that, not eat this, but eat everything in limited quantities. Be prudent when you're eating. And that's what chefs also do. We put everything on a plate. We put 3 portions of vegetables to 1 portion of meat. Your carbohydrates, all that is put on a plate, especially when it's pre-plated. Because chefs are giving you what is good for you. Not all of them, but some of them. But the best person is your grandmother, your grandmother's way of cooking. They did everything right a long time ago. We lost track of that. We've lost track of that. We've got to go back to that. And how do we go back to that? Is by digging out your grandmother's recipes, talking to your mother. That's why I said question. Question the fisherman. What is local fish? What is seasonal fish? All of that, you know.
There's a couple of questions. One of them, which is directly related back to your comment about tilapia. Michael, they said, we have seen tilapia in Bengal all through the last 30 years and more. So isn't tilapia an indigenous fish type? So maybe you could take that question and then I'll try to answer one of the other ones.
Well, tilapia has not been seen all across India. It's been seen all across India only in the last, I would say, 5 years, or not more than that. It's a fish related to the piranha species. Okay, it's not local to India. Even 30 years ago, somebody probably brought it across. Okay, far as I know, it is not indigenous to India.
It's not. It's not.
Yeah,
it's not.
and yeah, sorry.
No. So I was also going to respond to the other question about millets are hard to digest because of high fiber content, and our bodies used to white rice take a long time to get used to them. I mean, it's a fact, obviously, that if you are used to a very starchy diet with low fiber content, the body will take some time to adjust. But I don't think the switch from rice to millets is a huge problem by any means. I think it's just a matter of more a matter of taste than a matter of body getting used to it. Of course, ultimately, we cannot only talk about food without talking about exercise and the other side of the story, which is how are we and not just the carbohydrates, but even just moving our bodies in ways that assist digestion. So I don't think that the switch to millet is such a big problem. There are questions about do it gradually, absolutely. So non-local varieties grown locally. So there's somebody mentioning space number. Suddenly becoming very popular and everyone is growing them. So I agree that it's not that only consumers are being crazy and farmers are not going crazy. The farmers are also confronting a market which is pushing them in certain directions to grow gherkins for export, to grow flowers for export, to do mangoes in the off season, to do all kinds of stuff. And so that's what we talked about as sort of the larger structures being also important. Not just to take an example of just Karnataka again, which is where I did a little bit of work on water policy. One of the reasons why farmers are not growing, farmers themselves want to switch out of ragi and jowar to rice and sugarcane, is because there is no minimum support price for ragi and jowar, and there is no procurement system. There is a procurement system for rice. In the ration shop, people are given rice. There is no system for giving ragi, which is the traditional food locally, in the ration shop, or locally giving jowar in northern part of Karnataka. So these are relatively simple measures, as Mihir Shah keeps saying. The low-hanging fruit in terms of saving water is to switch to ragi and jowar or bajra, and we can push the governments to do it through the ration shops, through the food procurement systems, minimum support prices, midday meal schemes, and so on. But somebody has to do the pushing. So that's part of the story, actually. Uh, Gourds are a point of contention, especially with children. How to make such vegetables as bottle gourd or pointed gourd appealing? How to eat healthy without burning a hole in your pocket?
It's okay. The finance part of it, I'll leave it to somebody else. But I've always found that if you entice a kid well enough, they love soups, they love desserts. Uh, Pumpkin pie. Pumpkin pie is like, if you just put the foreign context of a foreign pumpkin pie to a kid, yes, he'll have it. You know. But if you're going to make it just an insipid little bhaji, they'll probably not like it. Uh, make it sound exotic is what I always say. There was one story about, I know someone wrote about, he took puffed rice from South America and some green coriander from somewhere else, and he was just explaining a pani puri. But he had all this very exotic terminology to it, and the kid lapped it up. And that's what you put to simple food. When you change the terminology or you change the technique, a kid will love it. You know. So
I wanted to add to that, Michael, though. And one is, of course, to again share with people is this reversed? I think it's showing reverse. First Food is one of the books that I mentioned from Center for Science and Environment. They've gathered a bunch of recipes from across the country. But so we have recipes which are not insipid, which are interesting without being necessarily spicy and so on. There's a huge range of recipes. But at the end of the day, I wanted to add to what Michael said. I think I take a little more extreme position than he does, which is that I think this whole idea of likes and dislikes in the upbringing of children, which is simply a reflection of our own upbringing, is something that we should be questioning. And I remember when we had our first child, my wife and I decided that we would abolish the word like from the dinner table completely. And we just don't use that word at all. Whatever is served is good food and we eat it. And I'm proud to say that because of that switch, and it was a tough one for me because I was raised as a child to be constantly fussy and about food and, oh, I don't like this, I don't like that. I went through a number of transitions, including living in hostels before I realized the importance of food and not being fussy about it. But this switch in our style of upbringing makes a huge difference. I'm proud to say that our children are absolutely, they will eat everything. Whatever the food is in front of them, because this whole business about the children don't eat gourds, don't eat greens, 90% of it is conditioning. 10% of it might be the aapke haath ki kala, your little bit of skill in making the food a little interesting, whether it is spinach or gourds. There's a last question, I think, from the moderator. What do you feel is the most urgent issue that India needs to tackle regarding food and sustainability right now?
For me, is I think changing the perspective of how you look at food. The change has to on how you approach food and how you question food. We don't question. That's the thing with us Indians. We're too complacent. We don't question. And yet, when we go out to eat in a restaurant, we are too demanding. You're not willing
Right.
to accept what the chef is giving you.
Right. Right.
And that is, I mean, I've seen people walk into a restaurant and say, "Mereko palak paneer de do." Palak paneer your wife can make for you at home. Come to eat the chef's cuisine. Enjoy what a chef has to offer. Because some chefs do think with sustainability in mind. They also want to bring about change. Uh, if you're only going to eat butter chicken when you go out, butter chicken is also made at home. Try something new. Go out, be adventurous. People go traveling to Paris, London, and a lot of them take food, those in those sterilized foam packs which you add hot water to it. They'll take them with them and travel with them and just add hot instead of eating the local cuisine.
Right. Right. Right.
So I think that change has to come about where we are willing to experiment. It's not just the upper classes or the middle classes. The lower rungs also have to experiment.
The difference is that the often the people living with limited income are then forced to go for food which not even necessarily the traditional food. For example, ragi eaters are being forced to eat rice because that's what's available in the public distribution system, in the ration shop, right? And if they
Right.
can't afford to buy their own ragi, then they have to buy the cheap 5 rupee rice or 2 rupee rice, because that's what's being pushed at them. So while I say in some sense, yes, the question of looking at our own habits is cuts across all classes. I think the point you made, that the hubris of the upper class, and as I said, that includes all of us, is something we should all be looking at. That going somewhere else and demanding only the food that I'm used to, only the food that I like, not willing to switch or change, and not willing to look at our food habits. The most urgent issue, I don't think we should be uh, limiting ourselves to again wanting a single issue. uh, Somebody might say it is about switching away from rice. Great. If they manage that transition, fantastic. If somebody else says it's about switching away from sugar, absolutely, that's equally important. If somebody says it's about encouraging local foods, and if you're in a rice growing region, then rice is the local food. So then it's not that bad as compared to if you're growing rice in 600 millimeters of rainfall with borewell water. So one cannot generalize and say water footprint of rice is the problem. Is a universal problem. It's a problem in many parts of the country, so we should look at that. We should look at the issue of forest foods, look issue of traditional foods, traditional food crops grown locally, millets, seasonality. The point Michael made was absolutely important, because the same food which is otherwise good for you and good for the environment, growing it during the off season is bad for you and bad for the environment, because you're also then using more chemicals, pesticides, or water in order to keep that crop going, or you'll be using some kind of a genetically modified crop and so on. So there are multiple dimensions. We can't run away from the complexity. There's a lot we can do, and that's, I think, what Michael has argued from his own work and shown from some of his work, that yes, we can really push the envelope.
So I think we've come to the end of a very lovely session. And I'd like to thank the Eco Network, Round Glass Thali, India Climate Collaborative, and Biodiversity Collaborative, as well as a lovely chat with Dr. Sharad, which has been very insightful. And one thing we all have to take away with us is that, yes, we can bring about the change, and we just have to do it gradually.
I just want to thanks a lot, Michael. I want to add a snippet of my own. As we saw from the questions, food is a complicated subject, and it's nothing easy that we can finish off in 1 hour. So, as it so happens, this week on Thursday evening at 7 p.m., ITRI and Ecological Society of Pune are running a session on food, in fact, and looking more at the food connection with farmer livelihoods, with the agrarian crisis, but also with our own food habits and environmental impacts. So Thursday evening at 7 p.m., the Prakash Gode Memorial Series, I'll just show the blurb for that, um, uh, is on food sufficiency, nutrition deficiency, and distributional inefficiency, linking all of this to the ecology. So please feel free to tune in. It's an open webinar. And I think Digangana is posting the link in the chat box on Facebook Live, or you can look up the Prakash Gode Memorial Series on Facebook itself, or message any of the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, and everyone. See you.